Welcome to our New Voices online talk series on women in the history of analytic philosophy and philosophy of science. This winter term talk series is organized in collaboration with Dr. Andreas Vrahimis from the University of Cyprus, whom I would like to thank for his commitment and support of our event. This talk series is devoted to the role of women in the history of early analytic philosophy and the philosophy of science. The series will include discussions of the ideas of 5 female philosophers, covering a period of over 100 years, beginning with the contributions of Emily Elizabeth Constance Jones at the end of the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th century, of Susan Stebbing and Margaret MacDonald up to the middle of the 20th century, and ending with Ilse Rosenthal Schneider and Dorothy Emmett, whose publications extended to the end of the 20th century. As this series of talks will make clear, women contributed substantially to the development of analytic philosophy, ranging from logic, epistemology, and philosophy of science to ethics, metaphysics, and philosophy of language. Let's now start our winter term 2025 talk series with a talk by Dr. Andreas Vrahimis. He is assistant professor at the Department of Classics and Philosophy at the University of Cyprus. His research focuses on the history of analytic philosophy and its different relations to the broader context of the history of philosophy in the 20th century. A number of his publications explore the purported divide between analytic and continental philosophy, including 2 monographs titled Encounters Between Analytic and Continental Philosophy, Palgrave-Macmillan, 2013, and Bergsonism and the History of Analytic Philosophy, Macmillan, 2022. He is also interested in and writes about aesthetics and the philosophy of art. This year, he is on a Humboldt Fellowship at the University of Paderborn and Humboldt University Berlin, working on a project on Susan Stebbing. And today, he will give a talk on Stebbing's critique of Schiller's pragmatism.
Thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to collaborate with you on this project. I really look forward to the other talks. Let's see, I'll have to share my screen now. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about a person whose work has been primarily a person whose work has been enjoying a growing revival of interest for longer than a decade now, which is Susan Stebbing. I suppose most of you are already familiar with some of the number of publications that have been recently exploring her work. Now, with a few exceptions, most of the recent research has focused primarily on Stebbing's more mature work from the 1930s onwards, which was well known already at the time. Nevertheless, Stebbing's philosophical career stretches back far earlier, with her first published work already written in 1912. And this is what my Humboldt project is focusing on. Now, in certain important respects, her earlier work had laid the groundwork for what followed. A case in point on which today's presentation will focus is her neglected debate with F.C.S. Schiller, which took place in the pages of Mind between 1912 and 1913. Now, the debate involves 2 replies by Stebbing and 2 responses by Schiller, who has the last word. As Siobhan Chapman, in her excellent work on Stebbing, writes, the debate is somewhat peculiar in character. It, quote, does not make very satisfactory reading. Both parties clearly feel strongly about the subject matter, but they do not really engage with it on the same level or concerning the same issues, and certainly no resolution is reached. Schiller is staunch in his defense of pragmatism and eager to point out what claims it does not make, but strikingly reluctant to admit to any positive claims. And this is very true, as you'll see. Stebbing presents herself as struggling to engage Schiller in a rational argument, while she either evades the issue or reiterates aspects of pragmatism that are not the focus of her attack. Now, as I will argue, Stebbing's presentation is at least partly justified, as Schiller does manage to evade the central issue at least until the end of the debate. We shall also see that there are multiple forms of miscommunication involved in the debate. Now, Stebbing's papers are incredibly short, in the debate, and though her criticisms are laconic, I think at least, I'm going to try to convince you that they pack a punch that Schiller was unable to detect from the outset at least. Schiller, as we shall see, insists on wanting to see proof for Stebbing's position. Most of this is found in her much more extensive treatment of pragmatism and its theory of truth in her 1912 MA dissertation titled Pragmatism and French Voluntarism. You can see the whole title in the slides. I'm not going to read it. Now, I take the fact that Schiller initially refers to her as Mr. Stebbing to prove that not only did he not know of her MA dissertation, which was only published as a book in 1914, so after their debate, but he also had not heard of Stebbing before reading her article. In ignorance of the bigger picture behind Stebbing's position, Schiller will try to turn the debate into a contest over who understands his own brand of pragmatism better, in which contest he thinks he will be the winner. But Stebbing certainly knew more than Schiller had suspected in her diagnosis of pragmatism as confusing the criterion for truth with an account of the nature of truth, which is at the background of her objections against Schiller, was already argued for elsewhere. Now, the main point of contention between Stebbing and Schiller is the question whether the dictum, all truths work, which the pragmatists, at least in Stebbing's opinion, explicitly uphold, and Schiller accepts this. The question is whether this could be converted simpliciter into all that works is true. The question is addressed in Schiller's 1911 paper, where he protests against the conversion. He argues instead that while pragmatism does accept that all truths work, it denies that this implicitly entails that all that works is true. Instead, Schiller acknowledges 8 types of truth claim that do indeed work, but are not true. Now, in his reply to Stebbing, Schiller claims that this erroneous interpretation of pragmatism originates in a 1902 paper by G.E. Moore. Now, this is clearly a misprint, and Schiller must mean the 1907 paper, where Moore explicitly addresses the issue of converting the two dicta. Moore extensively argues that even if such an account of truth must be, in his words, intensely silly, it is essential to the pragmatist outlook that the conversion be upheld. Moore shows that there are obvious counterexamples to the view that all that works is true, where untrue ideas can be useful, including, for example, lies useful to one side in a war, a broken watch that prevents me from catching a train that is involved in an accident, or a belief in eternal hell. Useful ideas that are completely unreal would have to be upheld by the pragmatist, Moore argues. Moore explicitly takes James to have sought for a criterion for truth, that is to say, a property applicable to all that is true and only to what is true. This, as we shall see, will form the crux of Stebbing's debate with Schiller, where Stebbing will fundamentally insist on this Moorean criticism of pragmatism. Also, similarly to Stebbing, Moore argues that the problem with James's position is the inclusion of the word all in the dictum. If we replace all with the word most, we will have asserted a, quote, generally admitted commonplace, unquote. The crucial difference played by the word all is precisely that it has provided a necessary and sufficient criterion for truth. If the pragmatists tone down their claim by replacing all with most, they no longer have a criterion and indeed have failed to contribute anything beyond the commonplace to philosophical debates on truth. It is primarily in response to Moore that Schiller in 1911 contests the claim that pragmatism must accept the conversion. To avoid this, Schiller proposes a seemingly ad hoc adjustment to the pragmatist doctrine, in which he attempts to accommodate not only Moore's specific counterexamples, but also a host of other similar cases. He thus comes up with 8 categories of things that work without being true, including lies, errors, methodological fictions, methodological assumptions, postulates, and then validated axiomatic truths and, interestingly, jokes. Now, it is this paper by Schiller that elicits Stebbing's first reply, objecting against Schiller's protest against the claim that pragmatism espouses the conversion. Stebbing's reply begins with a tidy series of numbered points, which are, however, not to be confused with numbered premises in an argument. Unfortunately, for me especially, as I've been working on this and it makes things confusing, as the debate unravels, while Stebbing very helpfully follows the initial numbering, so we know what she's talking about, what she's addressing, Schiller keeps changing the numbers. His numbering starts to become apparently randomized and irrelevant to the points. So in reconstructing the debate for this presentation, I hope to simplify matters by attempting to keep track, especially on the PowerPoint, of which point is in reply to which. Now, Stebbing's first reply very briefly condenses 3 numbered points. Her first and main point is that pragmatism is faced with a choice between either accepting the conversion or having no criterion for truth. Stebbing argues that, quote, it is the peculiar claim of pragmatism that it does provide such a criterion, and stresses that without a criterion, pragmatism is philosophically both useless and irrelevant. While she does not make this explicit, Stebbing clearly seeks to defend the aforementioned Moorean objection to pragmatism against Schiller's attempt to answer it. Schiller's protest against the grotesque conversion fails to avoid Moore's dilemma, depriving instead pragmatism of any criterion for truth. That's the first point. Stebbing's second point is that Schiller's protest thereby deprives pragmatism of any philosophically significant account of truth. To substantiate this thesis, Stebbing goes beyond Moore's claim that substituting all for most makes the pragmatist dictum a commonplace triviality. Instead, Stebbing argues that the dictum that all truths work is generally accepted, at least insofar as work is taken to mean, quote, are satisfactory from some point of view. What Stebbing has in mind here will require further unpacking, as will become obvious in the course of the debate. This is because Schiller and other pragmatists take work to imply the fulfillment of some practical function, while Stebbing will admit that she takes the notion of being satisfactory to range over a broader range of functions, including ones that are purely theoretical and not practical. In other words, unpacking this brief remark requires bringing the debate into the broader context of controversies between intellectualism, with which Stebbing sides, and its critics, such as the pragmatist Schiller. It is thus questionable whether Stebbing is justified in claiming the dictum to be generally acceptable, and Schiller can more readily contest Stebbing's objection here than he can Moore's. Nonetheless, whether the dictum is generally acceptable or not matters less than whether or not it provides a criterion for truth. The more crucial part of Stebbing's argument is that the dictum cannot provide a way of distinguishing between, on the one hand, those claims that are true because they work, and on the other hand, truth claims which satisfy some purpose but are found not to be true. The reason that this is crucial only becomes apparent as the debate progresses and Stebbing's very compressed initial statement fails to communicate the force of her argument to Schiller. For example, Stebbing does not precisely clarify that her mention of truth claims that work without being true is a direct reference to precisely those cases which Moore had posed as counterexamples to the conversion, and which Schiller's 1911 reply to Moore had attempted to accommodate into his theory by rejecting the conversion. As already shown, Schiller's reply to Moore presented 8 types of truth claims that work without being true. The sting of Stebbing's reply, as will become obvious in the course of the debate, lies in the question, how can Schiller distinguish his 8 types of truth claim, which work without being truths, from everything else that is true, from all other truths? The only way to do so would be by accepting some criterion for truth. And in the case of the pragmatists, the only criterion they discuss presupposes the conversion. But the pragmatist criterion in presupposing the conversion would exclude Schiller's cases. So Stebbing concludes Schiller must unavoidably fall into contradiction. Now, it is perhaps unfortunate, we've come now up to point 2, it's unfortunate perhaps that Stebbing does not leave the matter here, because the third point that she adds in support of her case will give Schiller adequate material to basically derail the debate. Stebbing here adduces some textual evidence that William James had explicitly upheld the conversion, while Schiller implicitly assumes it. Whether or not she is right in claiming so will take up a lot of space in the debate, even though with hindsight we can see it as simply an addendum to Stebbing's main argument. According to Stebbing, James explicitly states the conversion in 2 separate places in his work. In pragmatism, we find James claiming that it is useful because it is true, and it is true because it is useful, mean exactly the same thing. Later, in his 1907, The Meaning of Truth, Stebbing claims that, quote, we find him explicitly stating the grotesque conversion, namely what works is true and represents a reality for the individual for whom it works. James might have changed his mind later on. He says more things about this. But as I said, I don't think this is the central part in the debate. Stebbing also vaguely claims that Schiller assumes the conversion throughout his works, and even unwittingly does so in the 1911 paper that she is objecting to, in which he otherwise protests against the pragmatist commitment to the conversion. This is Stebbing quoting Schiller. Schiller says, truth claims which have worked badly are condemned as errors, even as those which have worked well are accepted as truth. The way Stebbing catches Schiller in an implicit contradiction here resembles, at least partly, her later critical analysis of politicians and advertisers and so on. And in either case, the approach apparently didn't win her many friends. Stebbing concludes that pragmatism is thus left with an impossible dilemma: either remain without a criterion and so philosophically uninteresting, or accept the grotesque conversion against which Schiller so vehemently protests. Though she has not yet made this clear, we shall see in what follows that Stebbing agrees with Schiller that the conversion is grotesque, and so thinks neither option is in fact tenable. To avoid the dilemma, her proposed solution is to abandon pragmatism altogether. Schiller doesn't really accept that. And so he begins his reply to Mr. Stebbing by thanking her for being the first to notice his protest. He proceeds to thus protest against her reply. Quote, I could wish that his communication had been better documented and had stated his refutation of pragmatism more fully. As already noted, Schiller's ignorance of Stebbing's work on pragmatism, unpublished at this point, underlies, obviously now, the protest. Schiller is at least partly justified in protesting against the brevity of Stebbing's highly compressed argument. Nevertheless, his first answer will systematically avoid her main criticism, forcing her to simply elaborate it further in a second reply. This is why, as Chapman notices, Stebbing will end up presenting herself as sort of laboring to engage Schiller in a rational conversation about her specific objection. As already noted, Schiller's reply reshuffles the numbering of Stebbing's points. This is because his first numbered point is a general answer to the Moorean type of objection to pragmatism and not specifically to Stebbing. So he notes that the conversion from all truths work to all that works is true is logically invalid, and it is those who assert it, he says, rather than the pragmatists who are, quote, oblivious of a simple rule of elementary logic. Funnily enough, this criticism is directed from someone who at the time was one of the fiercest critics of the new logic, of formal logic in general, at least um, at around the time here, against, and this is, I mean, by this I mean Schiller. Schiller was a critic of formal logic at the time, and he's directing this criticism against someone who would soon write the textbook on modern logic for the first half of the 20th century, at least, which is Stebbing. Now, in his second numbered point, Schiller proceeds by denying Stebbing's claim that the view that all truths work in the sense of satisfying some condition is generally acceptable. The disagreement here is due to Stebbing's failure to clarify that she employs a broader notion of being satisfactory than the pragmatists do. So Schiller responds by noting that intellectualists take knowing to be purely disinterested, which means they admit of truths that are absolutely useless. Here, Schiller would have benefited from knowledge of Stebbing's MA dissertation, where she precisely argues that Bergson and his followers are in disagreement with the pragmatists precisely because the former focus on a kind of purely disinterested and useless knowledge attained by intuition, while the pragmatist account of truth would entail that such an outlook is unattainable. In his third numbered point, Schiller focuses on dispelling Stebbing's claim that James explicitly endorses the conversion while he implicitly assumes it. In both cases, he refuses that the passages quoted by Stebbing are, quote, statements of pragmatic doctrine, unquote. Furthermore, he contends that in the passage quoted from The Meaning of Truth, James is in fact restating a view that he attributes to Schiller. So Schiller's polemic against Mr. Stebbing amounts here to merely denying that he holds the view that she attributes to him. Having proceeded past Stebbing's 3 points, Schiller's fourth point comes close to Stebbing's main criticism, even if he artfully evades it. Stebbing had argued that Schiller's rejection of the conversion would mean that pragmatism remains without a criterion for truth. Now, in response, Schiller simply accepts that this is so and claims that this is not a difficulty for pragmatism. Pragmatism never upheld a single criterion for truth, nor does it require one. Here, he simply appears to fail to see the import of Stebbing's claim that he needs a criterion to differentiate between those truths that work and his 8 types of truth claims that work without being true. The reason why Schiller may have ignored Stebbing's main objection is addressed in his 5th numbered point, which may at least partly justify his 4th. He claims that the criterion of truth that Stebbing and before her Moore had required is not one that pragmatism ever sought, required, or endorsed. He bases his contention on a division between 2 types of criteria, an intellectualist one that is absolute and which Stebbing demands, and a pragmatist one that is merely relative. He argues that pragmatism has abandoned the search for absolute criteria, which are a remnant of intellectualist ways of thinking. Now, according to Schiller, intellectualism has failed to come up with any such absolute criteria. Thus, in his view, The choice here would be between accepting the relativity involved in a pragmatist criterion or demanding an unreachable absolute criterion that no intellectualist can articulate. For Schiller, faced with a choice between pragmatism and skepticism, the former is a preferable option. Here, Schiller has vaguely begun to touch upon the substance of the debate, but it will take his second reply to make the philosophical significance of his disagreement with Stebbing clear. So let's move to Stebbing's second reply. Here, Stebbing mainly rearticulates her original criticisms, clarifying them and fortifying them in light of Schiller's answer. He declines Schiller's characterization of her position as an attempt to refute pragmatism and claims to have focused on calling attention to the fact that unless the dictum were simply convertible, it failed to provide a criterion. Note here that Stebbing maintains Schiller's new numbering, so her response makes more sense than all of Schiller's responses when it comes to knowing what each is responding to. Now, responding to Schiller's first point, which had in turn been an answer to Moore, Stebbing simply concedes that the conversion is indeed logically invalid. At the same time, she argues, providing a criterion for truth is nevertheless essential to the pragmatist theory. So Schiller's correct assertion that the conversion is logically invalid basically makes matters worse for the pragmatist. Perhaps even if Stebbing does not admit it, Schiller was therefore justified in seeing Stebbing's objection as a, quote, refutation of pragmatism. We saw that Schiller does not accept the dictum, all truths work, in Stebbing's broad sense of satisfying some condition. So he does not accept that the dictum, all truths work, in Stebbing's sense, is a generally accepted thesis. His objection cited intellectualist accounts of disinterested knowledge as counterexamples. In her second point, Stebbing clarifies that she employs a broader notion of being satisfactory, which can include even, for example, Bradley's account of a truth that can satisfy the intellect. So Schiller's objection here is invalid. We also saw Schiller objecting that the passage Stebbing quoted from James is in fact a statement of Schiller's own views. In her third point, Stebbing replies that James asserts that his and Schiller's views are identical, which recites as further evidence that both pragmatists accept the conversion. Schiller had furthermore protested that neither himself nor James are expressing pragmatist doctrine in the passages Stebbing cites as evidence of their upholding the conversion. Stebbing answers that she never denied that Schiller explicitly condemns the conversion. Her claim is rather that if pragmatism is to provide a criterion for truth, it must also assume the conversion. Thus, what she argues for is the conclusion that Schiller's condemnation of the conversion is inconsistent with his pragmatism. This he has so far failed to refute. As we have seen, Stebbing's first reply had insisted that pragmatism fails to provide a criterion for truth, and furthermore that such a criterion would be necessary in order to distinguish all truths from all other truth claims that work. In his answer, Schiller had vaguely denied that this is a difficulty for pragmatism. Stebbing rightly sees that Schiller has so far simply evaded the question, given that he wants to escape from a commitment to the conversion by acknowledging that there are truth claims that work without being true. Stebbing's question remains, how do you distinguish these from truth, if not by some criterion for truth? That is, the fact that truths work and nothing else does. Now, Schiller had sought to slip away from this question by diverting, So Schiller had sought to slip away from this question by diverting the debate to an apparently different topic, namely his distinction between two types of criteria for truth. Stebbing fails to grasp an opportunity here to press Schiller on this point precisely. It still remains unclear how a pragmatist relativistic criterion would be in a position to provide what would seem to be, as upheld by Schiller, an absolute distinction between truths on the one hand, and on the other hand, lies, postulates, jokes, and so on. Instead, Stebbing criticizes Schiller's twofold conception of criteria for truth. Quote, I fail to see how any property can be a criterion unless it belongs to every instance involved and to this only. What other meaning can a criterion have? I deny that he has offered a test in any intelligible sense of the word test. Here, Stebbing's answer is basically a reiteration of Moore's position that pragmatists like James, whether knowingly or not, really had sought for a criterion in the sense of a property that is applicable to all that is true and only to what is true. Schiller, as we shall see, will have an interesting reply to this thesis, where he will insist that there are indeed other intelligible senses of the word test that do conform to the Moorean demand for necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, Schiller gets the final word in the debate. I think it could have continued actually, but so in the final word, he starts to get what Stebbing is criticizing at least. Now, with Schiller's second answer to Stebbing, we do have some headway as the rift between their positions at least becomes clearer. Whereas some of the opposed assumptions at play on both sides had remained obscure at the beginning, the second set of papers brings them to the fore. Schiller begins by contesting Stebbing's contention that the conversion is essential to pragmatism. He will attempt to justify this by arguing at length against the view that pragmatism does need a criterion for truth as traditionally conceived. In this regard, Schiller's engagement with Stebbing will help clarify their philosophical differences. Nonetheless, Schiller's polemical insistence against Stebbing's interpretation of the quotations from his and James's texts is somewhat irrelevant to the gist of their philosophical disagreement. Schiller will insist again that Stebbing misattributes the grotesque conversion to both himself and James. Schiller tries to present Stebbing as pretending to know pragmatism better than its authors, and seems to think that his insistence on knowing his own mind is a rebuttal to her argument, which I will not further discuss here, apart from suggesting that maybe this is a product of his discovery of having misgendered her in the previous paper. Things become more interesting when Schiller begins to clarify what he means when he rejects Stebbing's conception of a criterion for truth. Stebbing and Moore alike had tried to push pragmatism into admitting that they had an account of the essence of truth, that is to say, a criterion according to which not only some or most, but all truths share the property of working. Stebbing takes this to imply that truths, quote, are attained by working, unquote, which also means that Schiller must think that they are true because they work. Even if some truths obviously exhibit this property, there is no reason to suppose that all truths share it. Schiller denies that his upholding that truths are true because they work commits him to an acceptance of the conversion. Instead, Schiller explains at length that when he says that truths work, this is only a matter of partial confirmation, never absolute verification. Notice that he hadn't really clarified this earlier in the debate, and this is very crucial in the debate. That is to say, he holds that at best we can have confirmation enough, the quote from Schiller, confirmation enough to make a truth claim pragmatically certain, but never enough to make a truth absolute. The working of truths is thus a temporary measure of confirmation, not an absolute criterion in the sense demanded by Moore and Stebbing. There is no such thing as one property that all truths have in common that is recognized by the pragmatist. In other words, pragmatism does not admit of something like an essence of truth. Schiller thus now clarifies that precisely because it denies that there is a property common to all truths, pragmatism does not uphold the criterion for truth in Stebbing's sense. According to Schiller, quote, what we speak of is testing truth claims, and this is a very different affair from Miss Stebbing's criteria. Here, Schiller has adjusted his vocabulary in light of Stebbing's inquiry, now distinguishing between a criterion for truth and a mode of testing that is applicable to truth claims. An infallibilist criterion would pertain to the absolute verification of truth claims, that is to say, the attachment to them of a truth value that is final and irrevocable. Fallibilistic testing, on the other hand, involves an ongoing process of partial confirmation. Schiller characterizes this process as, quote, comparing the values of different truth claims and discarding the less valuable as false. And this is 2 decades before Popper's falsificationism comes to the fore. Schiller seems not to have considered much earlier than Popper. I don't think he considered the possibility that falsification might in some ways be closer to the absolute criterion than confirmation is. So, according to Schiller, this fallibilist account informs how the pragmatist dictum all truths were should be correctly interpreted. It primarily serves a negative function, that of excluding untested or, more importantly, untestable hypotheses. Stebbing had focused on a very different positive function, that is defining an essential property belonging to all truths, which pragmatism isn't very interested in. On this basis, Schiller thinks he has demonstrated that since pragmatism can dispense with any criterion for truth, it need not assume the grotesque conversion. Contrary to Stebbing and Moore, contrary to what Stebbing and Moore had assumed, that I meant to say, pragmatism has no infallibilist criterion for truth, but only a fallibilistic account of testing that is indispensable for science. Now, notice here that even if Schiller has given us a fascinating account, historically at least fascinating account of pragmatism that connects with various issues that would occupy a central place in the later history of the philosophy of science, he still has not fully answered Stebbing's question. Stebbing had asked, if pragmatism dispenses with any criterion, then how is Schiller in a position to distinguish between what is true because it works and truth claims, lies, jokes, postulates, etc., that work but are not true? So, for example, if we assume Schiller is right, then what reason do we have for excluding his 8 types of truth claims from candidacy for confirmation? Must mathematical science or even formal logic assume only postulates that are somehow testable? If not, then what excludes the confirmationist approach from being applicable to postulates? Interestingly, it seems that already in 1912, Stebbing may have stumbled across one of the basic problems involved in upcoming debates surrounding logical empiricism and all the talk about verificationism. So I think I should leave it here and we can go into questions. Thank you very much.